Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 33. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. You can always access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Congressman Mike Gallagher. Mike has represented Wisconsin's 8th District in the U.S. House of Representatives since 2017. He served 7 years on active duty in the United States Marine Corps with 2 deployments to Iraq. He also served as the lead Republican staffer on Middle East and Counterterrorism in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and worked in the private sector at an energy and supply chain management company in Green Bay. He currently serves as chairman of the Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, as well as chairman of the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Cyber, Information Technologies, and Innovation, and on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Mike, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in. As I mentioned in the pre-show, we like to try to share a little bit about what brought you in life to this august moment where you're leading a select committee on strategic competition with the Chinese Communist Party, but what kind of brought you along your journey into public service?
Well, a colleague of mine have an ongoing joke in the House where every time you speak on the House floor, whoever is chairing, whoever is sitting in the speaker's seat says, "For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?" And we joke that if we were being honest, we would rise and say, "I seek recognition because I never got it as a child, and I'm trying to fill that void in my soul through public acclaim and public service." But the reality is, I think for me, I was always interested in the world outside of Wisconsin and America. Even as a very young student, I gravitated towards kind of foreign affairs, foreign policy, foreign languages. When I was in college, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but it was through the study of foreign languages that I started to go abroad. And I was doing an internship at a think tank studying terrorist targeting methods. And we had invaded Iraq the year prior. 9/11 had happened when I was a senior in high school, but I didn't come from a military family, so I didn't rush to join. But the more I started studying why we were in Iraq, what our response was to 9/11, I just became fascinated by it. I became fascinated by the Middle East. I started studying Arabic. That was my minor in college. And then I sort of realized along the way that the best way for me to apply those skills and pursue my passion was to serve in the military, which would also have the added benefit of allowing me to serve my country and pay back a debt I felt I owed to my family, my state, my community, etc., but also just test myself. I just felt like there was no better way to see what I was made of, sort of mentally, physically, as a leader, than becoming a Marine Corps officer and taking on that challenge. And so for me, that was just a great way to combine a lot of things into one. And that initial decision to join the Marine Corps, besides the decision to marry my wife, was the best one of my life. And that kind of led to, I guess now, almost 2 decades of public service. And honestly, whether it's as a Marine or as a member of Congress or as a staffer, I kind of all view it as the same thing. I view my life's mission as defending the country, deterring war. Having served in a couple wars, I can tell you that while deterrence may be hard, war is hell. So it really doesn't matter what my title is or my job is. That remains my passion. I just try and pursue it.
Well, thank you for that, Mike. Could you talk a little bit about what you're doing in your current duties? The Select Committee on Strategic Competition with the Chinese Communist Party is not something that's been around forever. It was an interesting new endeavor. Talk a little bit about what the mission has been and what some of the key takeaways have been in this, I guess, going to be a 2-year journey.
The mission, as I interpret it, when Speaker McCarthy had the idea and created the committee, was really to do 2 fundamental things. One is a communications function. It's to explain to our colleagues and by extension to the American people why any of this matters. Because Steve, as you know, particularly when it comes to the economic and technological side of this competition, but even the military side, there's no cost-free way to beat the CCP. It's going to require some serious investments. It's going to require some political investments in terms of extricating ourselves from our dependency on China in key areas. And if we don't answer the why the CCP is a threat, why it's not just a distant over there threat, why it's not just a problem for Taiwan, it's a right here at home threat. It is a threat to American sovereignty and even our sense of national identity. Then we're never going to muster the support necessary to get big things done. And we'll just slowly lose influence until all of a sudden we wake up and we've lost the new Cold War. The second is a more practical legislative function. We were tasked with coming up with a series of bipartisan policy recommendations and submitting those to the committees of jurisdiction, kind of a blueprint of how Congress can start to lead when it comes to competing effectively with the CCP. And we've done that. We submitted a report on the military aspect of this competition, the human rights aspect of this competition, and most recently on the economic and technological aspects of this competition. Sometimes I bristle at sort of this euphemism, strategic competition, because I think it sort of understates the nature of what's happening right now. And as I said before, like, this isn't a polite tennis match. It's an existential contest, I think, for what we want the future to look like. And I have no doubt that the CCP would love for us to destroy ourselves, would love to replace us as the world's dominant power and reshape the global order in a way that reflects their Marxist-Leninist system and their techno-totalitarian genocidal values. So that's kind of what it's all about. Communication and then practical policy recommendations for the speaker.
Well, certainly sounds like common sense to me, but what do you think caused us to take so long to get to a moment where we were ready at a leadership level to say the things that you just said? I mean, we had a warm bath of conventional wisdom for a long time where we couldn't say there was a Cold War. My own view is one was declared on us. Our only choice is whether and how to respond. But you're speaking as though we've reached a point of awakening, one that I would greatly welcome. But talk a little bit about why you think it took until about now. What do you think the factors were that said, you know what, we're in a new reality and we need to speak more clearly along the lines you just gave us?
Well, first, I'd like to foot stomp a point you just made, because I think it's correct and crucial, which is that China, or the CCP, more accurately, has been waging Cold War against us for quite some time. Ideological war, economic war, and now we have an unprecedented military buildup. Since, as historians continue to debate still when the old Cold War began, did it begin when Orwell first used the phrase? Did it begin with the invasion of Korea? Did it begin with the Soviet nuclear test in 1949? Whatever. We'll be debating this for decades to come when you and I are old and we're just arguing on a porch somewhere. But it at least dates back to 2009, which is pre-Xi Jinping, when they started to make all these expansive claims around various islands in the Pacific and started to militarize those islands. But the point here is that, like, we are responding to aggression. We are not we did not start that aggression. Our strategy is a defensive one. It's to maintain the status quo and a rules-based international system. Why did it take us so long to wake up? I hate to say it, but I think, well, first of all, this was a bipartisan bet that was made on integrating China into the global economy. There was a certain logic to it, right? That by doing that, they would moderate their political behavior. The only problem is that it did not work. We sort of fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the Chinese Communist Party. We repeatedly sort of attempted to wish away the communist part of CCP. But what happened is, though American manufacturing was decimated in the process, though our power eroded over the course of 20 years relative to the CCP, a lot of people got rich off the effort. And I think there's a continued resistance in the corporate and Wall Street world to talking open and honestly about China for fear of losing money. Maybe a more charitable way to put that is that after 2 decades of pursuing China's integration of the global economy and sort of pursuing this naive responsible stakeholder theory, we've now find ourselves very dependent on China, and there's no easy way to extricate ourselves. We are conjoined twins with China economically, and figuring out the balance of selective decoupling is a difficult thing to do. The only other thing I would say, and I do think both parties are starting to wake up, but we haven't actually done the things we need to do. And the reason for that is domestic politics, right? Particularly domestic progressive politics. There's a faction on the left that says any criticism of the CCP is tantamount to anti-Asian racism. And therefore, we can't get tough with the CCP, which is absurd because the biggest threat to individual liberty in China is the party. Like the Chinese people are the victims of the CCP's aggression, and we have no quarrel with them. And I can't think of a more chauvinistic, dare I say, racist regime than the one that's actively committing a genocide right now. So a variety of domestic political reasons that range from economic to ideological, we're still not moving fast enough. And there's still some cleavages between the parties as a result.
Yeah. The only thing I would maybe add to that list as a possible catalytic change was the COVID experience. I mean, really, I think that was a wake-up call to how dependent we were in some sensitive areas. Very obviously, the government in Beijing was not a responsible stakeholder in any element of that entire experience. And we paid dearly for it in a number of different ways. And so whatever it was, I guess I just say thank you that we are where we are. And I thank you and your colleagues for pushing this conversation along, because I do think, whether people like it or not, it begins with talking differently so that we're expressing a new understanding, a new vision, and then we start working on action and what can get done. Another key part of this in changing, military analogies and athletic analogies are never perfect, but this is a little bit like that aircraft carrier analogy where something very big has been going and has a lot of inertia, and it takes a lot of energy and some time and some care about how do you redirect that. And we're not looking at redirecting by 5 or 10 degrees. We're looking at redirecting in a substantial way. And that's going to take time, effort, and expense, as you've noted. But while we're doing that, there is one particular flashpoint that comes up often about an area of concern, and you were just there, and it's the island of Taiwan. It's a very important part of my life. I went there in my misguided youth and have forever been interested in what was happening there. But you were just in Taiwan. People seemed, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine or otherwise, they think, well, Taiwan might be next and China could be doing something. What were some of the kind of major priorities you had in taking a delegation there? And then what were kind of the key takeaways from those conversations?
Well, without asking your precise age, Steve, I would imagine when you were there, it was still a military dictatorship. Is that correct?
Just ending. So martial law had ended the year before I arrived.
Oh, okay. Well, I bring that up just because every time I go, well, I've been twice, so whatever. I'm just struck at how successfully they navigated that transition. And it's hard to find an example of a society like that has navigated a transition to now being one of the most free, open, vibrant, flourishing democracies in the world. I mean, they just had an election last month, which was raucous, vibrant, but it succeeded despite the rampant attempts by the CCP to interfere and undermine the election. And this point, I think, has a broader significance because there are those in China, and particularly in the CCP, who say that democracy is sort of fundamentally incompatible with Chinese culture and Chinese tradition, and Taiwan stands as a massive repudiation of that claim. On my most recent trip, I was struck by a few other things. One, I do think the government under President Tsai's leadership and what will soon be under President William Lai's leadership is making progress on preparing militarily. They've extended conscription from 4 months to a year, but they're really waiting on us to deliver weapon systems that they've bought, right? They're very successful economically. They don't need charity, but we haven't delivered. The backlog remains somewhere around $20 billion. And particularly when it comes to key systems like Harpoon missiles, which you need to sink Chinese ships, we just got to be moving faster. I sort of think that the good news is if you ever just walk the topography in Taiwan, which you have, Steve, you're struck by some obvious things. One, it's an island. There's only a few beaches where you could land a sizable force. And oh, by the way, once you do, the terrain is absolutely hellacious. I mean, good luck trying to transit over some of the mountains, which are highly vegetated. And it makes me believe that if we acted with a sense of urgency, we really could make this a difficult, if not impossible, problem for the PLA to solve in a military sense. The final thing I'd say is, in light of the CCP's attempts at election interference, I think it should give us a sense of urgency to make sure something similar doesn't happen in the United States. I particularly worry about a CCP effectively controlled app like TikTok being the dominant news platform for young Americans leading into an election cycle.
Yeah, well, that hits on one of the things I think has been a long-term value added in trying to engage with Taiwan is it's the most attacked part of the planet per capita with regard to influence operations, cyber, and other kinds of things. And its survival to date should have some best practices that we should want to learn from. Taiwan is not the United States, but we do have elections going on in individual districts all around the country. Being from the House of Representatives, you feel it more than anyone else. But there's definitely, I think, something to learn from. And boy, is it a painful point of neuralgia that they do pay for their weapons and material, and we seem to take a long time to deliver. Just in the context of other things going on in the world, I think a lot of Americans scratch their heads at that. Why wouldn't we want a more capable deterrent that's independent of us in Taiwan to give us better options should anything go the wrong way? But I'm glad that you had some of those useful takeaways, and hopefully colleagues and friends in policy circles will listen and have a little pep in their step on this stuff. But you mentioned at the end there TikTok. I know that has been a focal point of conversation on the Hill, in media and policy circles. It, I think, is a perfect case study and one of the key warnings the Select Committee has made about international companies that might domesticate in certain ways, find ways around the usual transparency and accountability standards that industry should have, and yet it has an outsized avenue into the demo, as people in the media would say, of people on the younger end of voting into starting out as families. They're spending a lot of time in this place, and it could be their number one source of news and information. But talk a little bit about what the concerns are. I mean, I see it more as almost a psychological weapon as much as I see it as an information weapon, because it's addictive and manipulative at its core. But besides that, what have been sort of the boundaries you've been grappling with about what the U.S. government can do at any level to try to set this right?
Yeah, I mean, if you analyze what Xi Jinping and CCP leaders have said, they've specifically and repeatedly talked about the value of short form video as a means of influencing foreign societies, as sort of an extension of Xi Jinping's magic weapon, to use his phrase, which is united front work, this kind of combination of espionage, influence operations, and coercion. And by the way, the United Front Work Department dwarfs the size of our State Department. He made various reforms when he took power to sort of make the UFWD report directly to him. And so I think we should view it in that context. And though the initial concerns about TikTok were more about surveillance, could it track your browser history, everything you do on your phone? And those concerns are valid. I think the real concern is TikTok's emergence as a news platform for the younger generation and the opacity surrounding its algorithm. And with a lack of algorithmic transparency, we simply don't know how a platform with that much influence over what information our kids digest, which is owned by a Chinese company, ByteDance, which is beholden, like every Chinese company, but particularly a national champion like ByteDance, to the party, and has apologized for not following appropriate party direction in the past and vowed to do it in the future. That's just simply an unacceptable state of affairs. It would be as if, and I've said this before, at the height of the Cold War, like let's say 1962 or 49, whatever, Sputnik, 57, 58, we had allowed the KGB and Pravda to buy NBC, ABC, the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. So I think what we have to do is learn the lessons from the Senate's failure to pass a bill in the Restricts Act, which was well-intentioned, but I think granted too much authority to the executive branch, which could be weaponized against American companies, and have a more narrowly tailored bill that allows for a ban or a forced divestiture. And what I would say to, let's say, Republican investors who have a lot of money on the line in terms of their ownership of a stake in ByteDance, it would seem to me that they would want TikTok to go public in America, not on like crappy Hong Kong market. The only way for that to happen is if there's a complete separation between ByteDance and TikTok. And then you can have Chinese TikTok, Douyin, and then you can have TikTok America with full algorithmic control. And then we can just have a separate fight about the corrosive impact of social media in general, which goes beyond TikTok and includes all the American social media companies that are increasing anxiety, depression, and suicide among our youth. So sorry for that long answer.
No, it's totally fine. It's also a depressing answer, but unfortunately it's where we are in terms of the social trends, these influences. I know we're going to be up against time soon, but I wanted to just flag kind of like a lightning round of a few topics that I think are of particular concern. And maybe you can share your perspective, whether it's from the Select Committee or the Congress going through the balance of this term. How can we make some headway? What can people do to support progress? You think of the malign influences of the CCP. I would put some of those things over dependence, whether it's in our ports, key industries, entertainment, what have you. Then after COVID, there's fentanyl, which I consider to be chemical warfare on the American family and our communities. It is in many ways a weapon of mass destruction, and it could be turned into an actual weapon of mass destruction, 9/11 like, if we're not careful. But talk a little bit about whether it's these or some of the other challenges that time keeps us from really diving into. Give us some hope about what are some of the steps we can take, the things you're going to push to try to help frame and make some progress in these other areas.
Well, first of all, I agree with your characterization of fentanyl. In terms of what's shifted the American people's view on China, I think it is COVID origins, as you said, but it's also fentanyl. And the fact is, the precursors are coming from China. I remain deeply skeptical about the Biden administration's dialogue on counter-narcotics cooperation. We've seen that movie before. And to me, I don't think you've overstated the case. And therefore, we need to be much more aggressive than how we traditionally approach this, which is just like scattershot sanctions on random Chinese companies or officials. I kind of think we need to think about this as, I'll get in trouble for saying this, but what the hell? Almost like a modern day flagrant violation of the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, it's killed now over 1 million Americans total. The stats are like 60,000 a year. I mean, it is horrific. Even in my community, we're way up in Northeast Wisconsin. We've had cartel murders. We've had families just destroyed. Steve, I don't need to tell you about this devastation. And so it's an all hands on deck effort. And I think we need to have a clear red line that we enforce. I think we need to be prepared to do things like that really hurt the CCP if they continue to allow precursor exports, to include dismantling the firewall. I think there's a lot of things we can do. Obviously, securing the southern border, because a lot of this is coming through the southern border. Going after WeChat Pay as a means of financing the fentanyl production. I would put that in the top 3. As I look at the rest of the Congress, I know we're up against time. I say the digital fentanyl of TikTok, the actual fentanyl, sensible legislation on outbound investments in Chinese military companies and critical technology, and then anything we can do to demand accountability when it comes to COVID. I mean, has anything disrupted our lives more than that? And the CCP has not been held accountable at all. It's absolutely unacceptable.
Well, our plate is full and our time is not. But I really, really want to thank you for spending it with us today. And if people want to follow your commentary and work, what's the best place for them to go to track you?
I write a lot of obscure op-eds. I'm sure I have a Twitter, but I don't, or an X, excuse me. But I don't. I've disconnected myself from the process, so I'm not a good self-promoter. I just wanted to say one thing in the 2 minutes or minute we have left, which is, Steve, your work has been absolutely critical on this. One of the first things I did when I got this committee was do a Zoom call with you, and you were very generous with your time and advice. So I hope whoever, the next Republican president is smart enough to put you in charge of a good chunk of China policy, because you've been an absolute thought leader. And I just am very grateful for the help you've provided to the committee. It's been absolutely essential.
Well, it's too kind, but I will graciously accept compliments, and all the adoration is greatly accepted. But thank you so much for your time today. To our audience, if you've enjoyed the China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing on YouTube or your preferred podcast platform. Thank you for joining, and a special thank you to Congressman Mike Gallagher for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.